The next day the rain poured down in torrents again, and when Mary looked out of her window the moor was almost hidden by grey mist and cloud. There couldn't be no going out today.
What do you do in your cottage when it rains like this?
Try to keep from under each other's feet, mostly. There does seem a lot of us then. Mother's a good-tempered woman, but she gets more than... The biggest ones goes out in the cowshed and plays there. Dickon, he doesn't mind the wet. He just goes out just the same as if the sun was shining. He says he sees things on rainy days as doesn't show when it's fair weather. He once found a little fox cub half drowned in its hole, and he brought it home in the bosom of his shirt to keep it warm. Its mother had been killed nearby, and the hole was swum out, and the rest of the litter was dead. He's got it at home now. He found a half-drowned young crow another time, and he brought it home too, and tamed it. It's named Soup, because it's so black, and it hops and flies about with him everywhere.
The time had come when Mary had forgotten to resent Martha's familiar talk. She had even begun to find it interesting, and to be sorry when she stopped or went away. Mary was most attracted by the mother and Dickon. When Martha told stories of what mother said or did, they always sounded comfortable.
If I had a raven or a fox club I could play with. But I have nothing.
Can the knit?
No.
Can the sew?
No.
Can the read?
Yes.
Then why doesn't the read something? Or learn a bit of spelling? Thou'st old enough to be learning thy book a good bit now.
I haven't any books. Those I had were left in India.
That's a pity. If Mrs. Medlock let thee go to the library, there's thousands of books in there.
The library?
Mary did not ask where the library was, because she was suddenly inspired by a new idea. She made up her mind to go and find it herself. She was not troubled about Mrs. Medlock. Mrs. Medlock seemed always to be in her comfortable housekeeper's sitting room downstairs. She came and looked at Mary every day or two, but no one inquired what she did or told her what to do. Mary supposed that perhaps this was the English way of treating children. Mary stood at the window for about 10 minutes that morning, thinking over the new idea which had come to her. She did not care very much about the library itself, because she had read very few books. But to hear of it brought back to her mind the 100 rooms with closed doors. She wondered if they were all really locked, and what she would find if she could get into any of them. Were there 100 really? Why shouldn't she go and see how many doors she could count? She had never been taught to ask permission to do things, and she knew nothing at all about authority. So she would not have thought it necessary to ask Mrs. Medlock if she may walk about the house, even if she had seen her. In this queer place one scarcely ever saw anyone at all. She opened the door of the room and went out into the corridor and began her wanderings. It was a long corridor, and it branched into other corridors and led her up flights of steps which mounted to others again. There were doors and doors, and there were pictures on the walls. Sometimes they were paintings of dark, curious landscapes, but oftener they were portraits of men and women in strange, grand costumes of satin and velvet. She found herself in one long gallery, whose walls were covered with these portraits. Some were pictures of children, little girls in thick satin frocks, which reached their feet and stood out all about them, and boys with puffed sleeves and lace collars and long hair, or with big ruffs around their necks. She always stopped to look at the children, and wonder what their names were, and where they had gone, and why they wore such odd clothes. There was a stiff, plain, little girl rather like herself. She wore a green brocade dress, and held a green parrot on her finger. Her eyes had a sharp, curious look.
Where do you live now? I wish you were here. It seems as if there was no one in this whole huge house but me. Wandering through the passages and up and down stairs, it feels as if no one but me has ever walked here. I haven't tried a door handle yet. Perhaps this one?
She was almost frightened for a moment when she felt that it turned without difficulty, and that when she pushed upon the door itself, it slowly and heavily opened. It was a massive door and opened into a big bedroom. There were embroidered hangings on the wall, and inlaid furniture, such as she had seen in India, stood about the room. A broad window looked out upon the moor, and over the mantel was another portrait of a stiff, plain little girl who seemed to stare at her more curiously than ever.
Perhaps she slept here once. She stares at me so that she makes me feel queer.
She opened more doors, and more. In one room, which looked like a lady's sitting room, the hangings were all embroidered velvet, and in a glass cabinet were about 100 little elephants made of ivory. They were of different sizes, and some had palanquins on their backs for people to ride in. Some were much bigger than the others, and some were so tiny that they seemed only babies. Mary had seen carved ivory in India, and she knew all about elephants. She opened the door of the cabinet and stood on a footstool and played with these for quite a long time. When she got tired, she set the elephants in order and shut the door of the cabinet. She had wandered about long enough to feel too tired to wander any further, and turned back. 2 or 3 times she lost her way by turning down the wrong corridor, and was obligated to ramble up and down until she found the right one. But at last she reached her own floor again, though she was some distance from her own room, and did not know exactly where she was. She stood at what seemed to be the end of a short passage with a tapestry on the wall.
I believe I have taken a wrong turn again. I don't know which way to go. There's that sound again. It's nearer than it was, and it is crying.
She put her hand accidentally on the tapestry near her, and then sprang back, feeling quite startled. The tapestry was the covering of a door, which fell open and showed her that there was another part of the corridor behind it, and Mrs. Medlock was coming up it with a bunch of keys in her hand and a very cross look on her face.
What are you doing in here? What did I tell you?
I turned round the wrong corner. I didn't know which way to go when I heard someone crying.
She quite hated Mrs. Medlock at that moment, but she hated her more the next.
You didn't hear anything of the sort. You come along back to your own nursery, or I'll box your ears.
And she took her by the arm and half pushed, half pulled her up one passage and down another until she pushed her in at the door of her own room.
Now, you stay where you're told to stay, or you'll find yourself locked up. The master had better get you a governess, same as he said he would. You're one that needs someone to look sharp after you. I've got enough to do.
There was someone crying. There was!
2 days after this, when Mary opened her eyes, she sat upright in bed immediately and called to Martha.
Look at the moor! Look at the moor!
The rainstorm had ended, and the grey mist and clouds had been swept away in the night by the wind. The wind itself had ceased, and a brilliant, deep blue sky arched high over the moorland. Never, never had Mary dreamed of a sky so blue. It was a deep, cool blue, which almost seemed to sparkle like the waters of some lovely bottomless lake. And here and there, high, high in the arched blueness, floated some small clouds of snow-white fleece. The far-reaching world of the moor itself looked softly blue instead of gloomy purple-black or awful dreary grey.
Aye, the storm's over for a bit. It does like this at this time of year. It goes off in a night like it was pretending like it had never been here and never meant to come again. That's because the springtime's on its way. It's a long way off yet, but it's coming.
I thought perhaps it always rained or looked dark in England.
No, not of the sort.
What does that mean?
In India, people spoke different dialects, which only a few people understood. So she was not surprised when Martha used words she did not know.
There now, I've talked broad Yorkshire again, like Mrs. Medlock said I mustn't. Not of the sort means nothing of the sort. But it takes so long to say it. Yorkshire's the sunniest place on earth when it's sunny. I told thee they'd like the moor after a bit. Just you wait until you see the gold-coloured gorse blossoms, and the blossoms of the broom, and the heather flowering, all purple bells. And the butterflies fluttering and bees humming and skylarks soaring up high and singing. You'll want to go out on it at sunrise and live on it all day like Dickon does.
Could I ever get there?
I don't know. That's never used their legs since they was born, it seems to me. They couldn't walk 5 miles. It's 5 miles to our cottage.
I should like to see your cottage.
Martha stared at her a moment, curiously. She was thinking that the small, plain face did not look quite as sour at this moment as it had done the first morning she saw it. It looked just a trifle like her little sister's did when she wanted something very much.
I'll ask Mother about it. She's one of them that nearly always sees a way to do things. It's my day out today, and I'm going home. I'm glad. Miss Medlock thinks a lot of Mother. Perhaps she could talk to her.
I like your mother.
I should think they did.
I've never seen her.
No, there hasn't. Well, she's that sensible and hard-working and good-natured and clean that no one could help liking her, whether they'd seen her or not. When I'm going home to her on my day out, I just jump for joy when I'm crossing the moor.
I like Dickon, and I've never seen him.
Well, I've told thee that the very birds likes him, and the rabbits and wild sheep and ponies, and the foxes themselves. I wonder what Dickon would think of thee.
He wouldn't like me. No one does.
How dost thou like thyself?
Not at all, really. But I never thought of that before.
Mother said that to me. Mother said that to me once. She was at her wash tub, and I was in a bad temper and talking ill folk, and she turns round on me and says, "The young vixen there! There the stands saying that doesn't like this one and that doesn't like that one. How does thou like thyself?" It made me laugh, and it brought me to my senses in a minute. Anyway, miss, come eat your breakfast. I'll be walking 5 miles across the moor to the cottage, and I need to be on my way.
Mary felt lonelier than ever when she knew Martha was no longer in the house. She went out into the gardens as quickly as possible, and the first thing she did was to run round and round the fountain flower garden 10 times. She counted the times carefully, and when she had finished, she felt in better spirits. The sunshine made the whole place look different. The high, deep blue sky arched over Misselthwaite as well as over the moor, and she kept lifting her face and looking up into it, trying to imagine what it would be like to lie down on one of those little snow-white clouds and float about. She went into the first kitchen garden and found Ben Weatherstaff working there with 2 other gardeners. The change in the weather seemed to have done him good. He spoke to her of his own accord.
"Springtime's coming. Cannot thou smell it?"
I smell something nice and fresh and damp.
"That's the good rich earth. It's in a good humor, making ready to grow things. It's glad when planting time comes. It's dull in the winter when there's naught to do. In the flower gardens out there, there'll be things stirring, down below in the dark. The sun's warming them. You'll see bits of green spikes sticking out of the black earth after a bit.
What will they be?"
Crocuses and snowdrops and daffy downy-dillies. Has thou never seen 'em?
No, everything is hot and wet and green after the rains in India. And I think things grow up overnight.
These won't grow up overnight. They'll have to wait for 'em. They'll poke up a bit higher here and push out a spike or more there and uncurl a leaf this day and another that. You watch 'em.
I am going to. The robin!
Well, there you are, come at last.
Do you think he remembers me?
Remembers thee? He knows every cabbage stump in the gardens, let alone the people. He's never seen a little wench here before, and he's bent on finding all about thee. There's no need to try and hide anything from him.
Are things stirring down below in the dark in the garden where he lives?
What garden?
The one where the old rose trees are. Are all the flowers dead, or do some of them come again in the summer? Are there ever any roses?
Ask him. He's the only one that knows. No one else has been inside for 10 years.
10 years is a long time. I was born 10 years ago. Goodbye, Ben Weatherstaff.
She had begun to like the garden, just as she had begun to like the robin and Dickon and Martha's mother. She was beginning to like Martha, too. That seemed a good many people to like, when you were not used to liking. She thought of the robin as one of the people. She went to her walk outside the long, ivy-colored wall over which she could see the treetops, and the second time she walked up and down, the most interesting and exciting thing happened to her, and it was through Ben Weatherstaff's robin.
You do remember me, you do! You are prettier than anything else in the world. Chirp, chirp, chirp. Chirp, 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 chirp. You aren't a bit afraid of me, are you? You know I would never do anything to startle or frighten you. You know, because you really are a person. You're nicer than any other person in the world. Your red breast looks just like a satin waistcoat. Look at you, puffing your tiny chest out and flirting your feathers. I believe you want to show me just how important and like a human person a robin can.
Bed where the robin was hopping and pecking at things was not quite bare. It was bare of flowers because the perennial plants had been cut down for their winter's rest, but there were tall shrubs and low ones, which grew together at the back of the bed. And as the robin hopped about under them, she saw him hop over a small pile of freshly turned up earth. He stopped on it to look for a worm. The earth had been turned up because a dog had been trying to dig up a mole, and he had scratched quite a deep hole. Mary looked at it, not really knowing why the hole was there, and as she looked, she saw something almost buried in the newly turned soil. It was something like a ring of rusty iron or brass, and when the robin flew up into a tree nearby, she put out her hand and picked the ring up. There was more than a ring, however. It was a large old key, which looked as if it had been buried a long time.
Perhaps it has been buried for 10 years. Perhaps it is the key to the garden.
She looked at the key quite a long time. She turned it over and over and thought about it. As I have said before, she was not a child who had been trained to ask permission or consult her elders about things. All she thought about the key was that if it was the key to the closed garden, and she could find out where the door was, she could perhaps open it and see what was inside the walls, and what had happened to the rose trees. Living, as it were, all by herself in a house with 100 mysteriously closed rooms, and having nothing whatever to do to amuse herself, had set her inactive brain to working and was actually awakening her imagination. There is no doubt that the fresh, strong, pure air from the moor had a great deal to do with it. Just as it had given her appetite, and fighting with the wind had stirred her blood, so the same things had stirred her mind. She put the key in her pocket and walked up and down her walk and looked at the wall, or rather at the ivy growing on it. The ivy was the baffling thing. However carefully she looked, she could see nothing but thickly growing, glossy, dark green leaves.
It seems so silly to be so near it and not be able to get in. I'm going to take the key with me every time I go out, so that if I ever should find the hidden door, I will be ready.
The next morning, Martha was back at work. Mrs. Medlock had allowed her to sleep all night at the cottage, and she had returned with cheeks redder than ever and in the best of spirits.
I got up at 4 o'clock. It was pretty on the moor, with the birds getting up and the rabbits scampering about and the sun rising. I didn't walk all the way. A farmer gave me a ride in his cart, and I did enjoy myself. But I had such a lovely time at home. I even made the children dough cakes with a bit of brown sugar on top. I had 'em all piping hot when they came in from playing on the moor, and the cottage smelt so nice, and there was a good fire, and they just shouted for joy. Our Dickon, he said our cottage was good enough for a king. In the inventing, we all sat around the fire while Mother and I sewed patches on torn clothes and mended stockings, and I told him all about the little girl who had come to the manor from India. They did like to hear about you. They wanted to know all about the people you lived around and the ship you came in. I couldn't tell them enough.
I'll tell you a great deal more before your next day out, so that you will have more to talk about. I dare say they would like to hear about riding elephants and camels, and about the officers going to hunt tigers.
My word, it would set 'em clean off their heads. Would you really do that, miss? It would be the same as a wild beast show, like we heard they had in York once.
India is quite different from Yorkshire. I never thought of that. Did Dickon and your mother like to hear you talk about me?
Why, our Dickon's eyes nearly started out of his head. They got that round. But Mother, She was put out about your seeming to be all about yourself. She said, hasn't Mr. Craven got no governess for her, nor no nurse? And I said, no, he hasn't, though Miss Medlock says he will when he thinks of it, but she says he mayn't think of it for 2 or 3 years.
I don't want a governess.
But Mother says you ought to be learning your book by this time, and you ought to have a woman to look after you. She said, now, Martha, you just think how you'd feel yourself in a place like that, wandering about all alone, and no mother. You do your best to cheer her up, she says, and I said I would.
You do cheer me up. I like to hear you talk.
Well then, what is the think? I've brought thee a present.
A present?
You wait right here. I've left it in the other room.
How can a cottage full of 14 hungry people give anyone a present?
A man was driving across the moor, peddling,
What does that mean?
selling things from a cart. They drive all along the houses and the villages scattered across the moor.
Oh,
And he stopped his cart at our door. He had pots and pans and odds and ends, but Mother had no money to buy anything. Just as he was going away, Elizabeth Ellen called out, Mother, he's got skipping ropes with red and blue handles. And Mother, she calls out, Here, how much are they? And the man says, 2pence. And Mother, she began fumbling in her pocket, and she says to me, Martha, thou bought me thy wages like a good lass, and I've got 4 places to put every penny, but I'm just going to take 2pence out of it to buy that child a skipping rope. And she bought one, and here it is.
She brought it out from under her apron and exhibited it quite proudly. It was a strong, slender rope with a striped red and blue handle at each end. But Mary Lennox had never seen a skipping rope before. She gazed at it with a mystified expression.
what is it for?
4? Does it mean they've got no skipping ropes in India? For all they've got elephants and tigers and camels? This is what it's for. Just watch me.
And she ran into the middle of the room and, taking a handle in each hand, began to skip and skip and skip, while Mary turned in her chair to stare at her. The interest and curiosity in Mistress Mary's face delighted Martha, and she went on skipping, and counted as she skipped, until she reached 100.
98, 99, 100. Oh, I could skip longer than that. I skipped as much as 500 when I was 12. Oh, but I was in practice then.
It looks nice. Your mother is a kind woman. Do you think I could ever skip like that?
You just try it. You can't skip 100 at first, but if you practice, you'll mount up. That's what Mother said. She says nothing will do her more good than skipping rope. It's the sensiblest toy a child can have. Let her play out in the fresh air skipping, and it'll stretch her legs and arms and give her some strength in 'em.
It was plain that there was not a great deal of strength in Mistress Mary's arms and legs when she first began to skip. She was not very clever at it, but she liked it so much that she did not want to stop.
Put on the things and run and skip out of doors. Mother said I must keep you out of doors as much as you could, even when it rains a bit, so long as the wrap up warm.
Martha, they were your wages. It was your 2pence, really. Thank you.
She said it so stiffly because she was not used to thanking people or noticing that they did things for her, and so she held out her hand because she did not know what else to do. Martha gave her hand a clumsy little shake, as if she was not accustomed to this sort of thing either.
Thou art a queer old womanish thing. Run off outside and play with our rope.
Mistress Mary felt awkward as she went out of the room. Yorkshire people were strange, and Martha was always rather a puzzle to her. At first she had disliked her very much, but now she did not. The skipping rope was a wonderful thing. She counted and skipped and skipped and counted, until her cheeks were quite red, and she was more interested than she had ever been since she was born. The sun was shining and a little wind was blowing, not a roaring wind, but one which came in delightful little gust and brought a fresh scent of newly turned earth with it. She skipped round the fountain garden, and up one walk and down another. She skipped at last to the kitchen garden, and saw Ben Weatherstaff digging and talking to the robin, which was hopping about him. Mary skipped round all the gardens and round the orchard, resting every few minutes. At length she went to her own special walk and made up her mind to try if she could skip the whole length of it. It was a good long skip, and she began slowly, but before she had gone halfway down the path, she was so hot and breathless that she was obligated to stop. She did not mind much, because she had already counted up to 30. She stopped with a little laugh of pleasure, and there, lo and behold, was the robin. He was swaying on a long branch of ivy. He had followed her and greeted her with a chirp. As Mary had skipped toward him, she felt something heavy in her pocket strike against her at each jump.
You showed me where the key was yesterday. You ought to show me the door today. But I don't believe you know.
Mary Lennox had heard a great deal about magic in her Aya's stories, and she always said that what happened almost at the same moment was magic. One of the nice little gusts of wind rushed down the walk, and it was a stronger one than the rest. It was strong enough to wave the branches of the trees, and it was more than strong enough to sway the trailing sprays of untrimmed ivy hanging from the wall. Mary had stepped close to the robin, and suddenly the gust of wind swung aside some loose ivy trails, and more suddenly still she jumped toward it and caught it in her hand. This she did not because she had seen something under it, a round knob which had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of a door. She put her hands under the leaves and began to pull and push them aside. Thick as the ivy hung, it nearly all was a loose and swinging curtain, though some had crept over wood and iron. Mary's heart began to thump, and her hands to shake a little in her delight and excitement. The robin kept singing and twittering away, and tilting his head on one side, as if he were as excited as she was.
What is this under my hand? It's square and feels like iron, and there's a hole? A keyhole! It is the lock of the door that's been closed for 10 years. The key! I have the key here in my pocket. It fits. It's hard to turn. It's so rusty.
And then she took a long breath and looked behind her up the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was coming. No one ever did come, it seemed, and she took another long breath because she could not help it, and she held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. Then she slipped through it and shut it behind her, and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement, and wonder, and delight.
I am standing in the secret garden. know what to